Everything that we're going to talk about today is learned experiences. It's not prescriptive, so I think what I'd love for people to take away what's relevant for them and what they can put into practice, and that goes from whether you're new to remote or whether you're experienced. Hopefully, there'll be something you can take away. And yeah, I'll keep an eye on the chat because I'd love to hear people's views, maybe some of the challenges or opportunities that they've had as well. So yeah, keen to get started. So yeah.
Awesome. Thank you, Gary. So I'll be watching and listening as well. Please, guys, do not forget, ask your questions as we move along. And I'll let you take it away, Gary.
Awesome. Great. So yeah, like I think we had a great intro. What we're going to look at covering today, you can see on the agenda is we're focusing on communication. We're going to look at some of the strategies, although we've deemed it leadership strategies, it's things that you can influence as part of a team as well. And then we're going to talk about the different styles of communication and remote work, and more importantly, how you can shift some of the styles that you're using at the moment to be a bit more progressive, how you can have those conversations as well. And then we'll touch on knowledge management, so which is really a superpower of remote teams. And then we'll have plenty of time at the end. So if you do have questions, please ask in the chat. We'll keep an eye on that. And yeah, we'll go from there. So let's get started. I'll ask Fidji if you can keep an eye on the chat because I don't think I can see it visibly here. I'll just double check. Yeah, I can. We're okay. I've got an eye in the chat. So yeah, getting started. I've already done my introduction, so we'll jump forward from there. Um, but yeah, we're going to just touch on the importance of effective communication to begin with. This is more like your reason why effective communication is important, especially in a remote environment where you don't have physical pointers or like notes that you would get in an office environment. In a remote industry, you have to be very clear on your communication. So it's really important when you're doing this that you're focused on the benefits of it. So what we're going to start here is like in an optimum workforce where you have really great communication, if that's synchronous or asynchronous, like why is that most important? So these are just some of the benefits that from an employee perspective, you would start to gain if you can put the right practices in place. But also as some of the things that the organization would find beneficial. The reason why I put that up on the screen is sometimes if you've joined a company or if you're working in a team, you may want to maybe suggest some different ideas to improve the ways of working. And quite often people will want to understand like why is that important to the organization. So I think it's really useful to always like pinpoint that and showcase that. Because there's numerous benefits for not only employees, but for organizations as well. I think the major benefits that you can see on the screen for me is like the deep focus time that you can really get from really managing your calendar more effectively and starting to balance the way you communicate. It really gives you much more time, and that can impact your well-being in a positive way as well. For organizations, as you can see there, naturally they love the fact that people can be more productive. But I think something that's not touched on often is the quality of work is often higher because people have fewer interruptions and there's much more transparency in the work and the communication that's out there and the information that's readily available as well. So these are really just introductions into why it's so important to have effective communication. I think the other aspect I wanted to touch on was around the actual principles in remote work. So if we look at, I always say work is not a mindset, it's a mindset, it's not a place. But what you're seeing on screen here is not necessarily just about communication, it's really about the core principles, the foundation of successful remote work. So when people do this correctly and when they fundamentally put these types of methods in place, then it fosters trust, it fosters clear direction, it also promotes open communication. So remote teams can really thrive and also leaders can thrive as well in their work. So when we talk about trust, it's so critical because leaders need to trust their teams to perform and address issues openly without actually seeing them. They need to value outcomes over visibility as well. But one of the other aspects that's super important is clarity. So what I mean by that is you have to, as a leader and as an organization, And also, as a team, provide clarity on what you're trying to achieve, what are the outcomes that you're working towards, and make sure people can really showcase their work as they're going along. Because that won't draw questions. I think one of the things with communication and remote work is often people might go quiet or they might go dark in terms of it. That's not a good thing because then that might drag questions from leaders of what people are working on. So I think it's always clear, show progress indicators, also showcase your work, even in an asynchronous manner. So there's some methods that we'll touch on in there. And then the last one's transparency. The reason that's so important is across all the different time zones that you're working, like it's really important that if you need information, you're not having to interrupt people. So building a culture that's towards documentation of processes and information so that when people want to find information they need to do their job, they can just readily go and do that. Obviously, that's in an ideal world, you would have these things in place. So we're going to just talk about some of the ways that you can get to that point. Um, so yeah, I'm just keeping an eye on the chat there. So Michael, I'm just going to jump in. I'm from Glasgow. That's awesome that you went to uni in Aberdeen. So that's only a few hours away from me. So thanks for that. Okay, so before we delve into like the communication types, I think one of the things I wanted to touch on was the leadership that's required in a remote sort of environment. That's not necessarily from an executive level, that can be team level, but also looking at yourself as a leader within a team. So you'll see in things like sports, sometimes in sports, you get captains of teams, but that doesn't necessarily mean there's only one leader. There's multiple leaders at different times. So there's a way that you can influence that. The type of leader that you're looking for essentially starts with adaptive leaders. What people used to talk about was digitally native. What people meant by that was people that were born in an era where it was all technology led, and the way that work was delivered was through digital methods. I'm not a big believer in that, and I think what you can see over time is if you're an adaptive leader, if you've got a growth mindset, then you've got the ability to sort of change the dynamic of the way that you're working. So, an example of this might be the Microsoft CEO that you see on the screen. He's a high-profile version of this, so Satya Nadella. Now, we're not saying that Microsoft are like an amazing organization. We're not saying that under this realm. What we're saying is, if you look at his leadership when he came into that organization, they were pretty dysfunctional and they never really had a clear vision of what they were working towards. So he really drove a lot of cultural and strategic transformation. He really fostered a collaboration and a growth mindset in that company and started to pivot towards building products like Microsoft Teams and Copilot and these different things that they've acquired as well. So he's shown a lot of innovation and he's shown he's able to adapt to the new ways of working and also disrupt his own business. So that's really key. There's some great books out there by some authors called Malcolm Gladwell. There's another one by Clay Christensen, a couple of books. And they all talk about you need to disrupt your own organization because there's always startups that are doing that. That doesn't just mean products, that means your ways of working as well. You're always looking at ways to be more innovative, more creative, more efficient. So these are all really important. The other aspect of teams is goes without saying you want to work with talented people. Like I think talented people are really motivated by solving problems and actually they want environments that are tough, that are going to be challenged. I don't always agree with everything Steve Jobs said in his lifetime, but one that always resonates with me is you don't hire really talented people and tell them how to solve that problem. Like you want them to like exercise that muscle. So um I think as much as you can, you won't always have control over it because you'll come into teams, but you can demonstrate different behaviors that can then start to influence people in a positive way. You can start to develop rituals and practices as well. Where a team's like really mature, then a sign of a mature team is like how autonomous it is. So how much it can choose when and how it does its work. And autonomy also is a real key driver to just having much better balance in terms of well-being at work as well. So these are all fundamentally important. We'll just look at the four kind of key aspects of how you can influence a team. So this can be applied if you're someone who's building a team, if you're just part of a team and you want to sort of start to manifest these things. But there's four core ones that I typically talk about. There's strong purpose. And I think a lot of people talk about purpose. What we're meaning here is, do team members have a strong alignment with the company's mission or the team's purpose? And I think that really is important because then they're going to be motivated. I think another aspect which is great about remote work is you can really demonstrate what I call a cultural contribution. So I think in the past decade or so, a lot of people say things like, is this person a good cultural fit? What I try and look at is not a cultural fit. Are they going to bring a cultural contribution? So can they look at a product or a way of working through a lens that's slightly different and maybe suggest something? Because ways of working and effective communication, you have to navigate multiple different geographies. So there are going to be small adaptations as you go across that. So it's really important you build teams out that have that lens. And that also goes for experience. So there may be people that are like 2 months into their first ever job. There might be people that are 25 years in. What I mean by diverse in experience is really strive for that growth mindset. So like you may have a disciplinary, which is like, say for instance, you're an engineer, that's like a mastery skill, but it doesn't mean you can't have a growth mindset to understand better like what's the product owner's role in this, what's the UX role in this, because that's going to give you a much greater lens. And the more diverse your experience is, the more you can contribute as well, which is great. And then probably the favorite topic for a lot of people is ego. And what I mean by that is I used to like talk about this as you want people on a team without ego. I don't think that can ever exist, to be quite honest. So what you really want is low egos. And what I mean by that is you're seeking people that understand the importance of teamwork. They understand the importance of servant leadership. Um, there's a great quote, it's by a coach called Herb Brooks. It's actually 44 years old when I was thinking about it this morning, which is a long time ago, but it's still relevant, I promise. Um, and that coach was entrusted with building out a country's Olympic ice hockey team. And at the time, he could choose anyone really in the country. And a lot of the people who were the execs above him were starting to question him on some of his choices. And there was a scene where essentially he was asked, you're not picking all the best players. And he came around and said, I'm not looking for the best players, I'm looking for the right players. And that's so powerful because if you have someone who is super talented but has a massive ego, that's going to be so disruptive to a team dynamic. It's going to destroy a team spirit. So always think about that when you're bringing yourself to work. Like think about team first. There's a great analogy as well. If you take 7 matchsticks, like each one of those matchsticks on their own can be snapped in half. If you put those 7 together, it's really difficult to break them. So I think it's important to have people that understand the value of team and they know that teams win. It's not about doing it alone. So I think that's important just in the way you bring yourself to work as well. So I just wanted to touch on really framing some of those fundamentals. Um, and then this final slide is really about how do you set a path. So this is more an organizational or team level as well. And then we'll really start to delve into more of the ways that you can be effective in your communication. So what you're seeing in the page here is it's just like a drawing that I've loved for a number of years. Ultimately, they're trying to solve a problem in this company where they want to cross a river. What you're seeing here is 4 different places that most organizations sit culturally, and it's based on how the leaders and the team operate. So on the left-hand side, you've got how aligned are the team in terms of what they're trying to achieve. And in the bottom bar here, you've got how much autonomy do they have in solving these problems. So what you're really seeing is a lot of organizations will typically sit in these two spaces at the bottom. So chaos and micromanagement. These are really bad places to be because essentially micromanagement, everyone's probably been part of that culture. You aren't quite sure what you're meant to be doing, but you don't have much autonomy to apply what you're trying to do. These companies often fail fast. Um, Another aspect of that is where actually you've got high autonomy. So you do have a lot of trust in terms of solving things, but you're not quite sure what you're trying to solve. Again, people are just off doing what they think they should be doing. Where you typically find most companies is in the top two. And I'm not saying both of these are wrong, but there's an optimum space to be. So The first one is the pitfall, and the reason why I call it the pitfall is the company are aligned so that the leaders and the team members are very clear of these are the outcomes we're working towards. So whether that's a sprint, whether that's a longer term vision and a strategy, everyone in the company understands that. So we need to cross the river, but then they're told how to go and solve those problems. The reason why I say that's okay at first is if you get super talented people, they'll kind of go with that for a period of time. But at some point, they're going to start to question, am I able to exert my skills and my all the things that I've learned about engineering or UX or design? They're not because they're ultimately being told what to go and build and how to build it. So what you really want to target as a company, and that's where trust and clarity and transparency come in. Can you align your teams, but can you provide the autonomy to go and let them figure it out? So it comes back to what Steve Jobs was saying. I can set the vision for Apple and I know where we want to go, but I need the teams, the smart people, the intelligent people to go and figure out how to do that. So that's a really good space to be in. So I definitely think like in the chat, it might be quite interesting just to hear from you what quadrant you think like some of your teams might fall into and why, and maybe how you could maybe come away with a different aspect and move that needle a little bit. You don't need to answer that just now, but it'd be quite fascinating for us to see that. So cool. And that's known as a sweet spot. So I'm not going to touch a lot on technology, ironically, like in terms of digital tools. But what I'm going to mention here is like when you're in an organization and you're trying to build trust, clarity, and transparency, and you're trying to align people and have the visibility of what's going on, then you need the right digital tools to enable your company and your teams to do that. So what I've done here is just showcase what are the three fundamental categories. It doesn't really matter what the tool is to a degree, because the tool is not the goal. The goal is how do we provide a space for people to collaborate? How do we provide a tool that people can go and find the information they need and trust that information is being correct? And then how do we track the progress of that? And how do we give people the ability to show their progress as an indicator? So those are just some examples, not recommendations, just to say. Other tools are available, but typically your digital office, your environment for chatting, collaborating, and files are Slack and Teams. You might have Almanac or Notion. You might even use Microsoft Loop or SharePoint for that type of stuff. And then for project management, there's tons out there. There's Microsoft Planner, there's Asana, Monday, Trello. But that's really important because if you don't have those fundamental tools in place, it's going to be really difficult to build the culture that you want and really demonstrate that. And yeah, that's a great point as well, just coming in the chat. So these tools should be available on your mobile as well. So remote teams, everything should be like thought of as like mobile first. You want that user experience to be really frictionless so that people can get the information they need. And we'll come to that a little bit later, why that's so important. Okay, so we're just going to move on to the next point here, which is really the art of asynchronous communication. If you're new to remote work, you've probably heard this term. If you haven't, people often refer to it as async or async first. There's lots of different terms. Fundamentally, just breaking it down, asynchronous communication is, as it says on the screen there, like it's something that doesn't require an immediate response. Um, Now, this isn't about removing everything that's synchronous in an organization, which a lot of people think it's about. There's so much importance to intentional in-person or intentional synchronous communication. This is really about evaluating what you do just now and understanding how you can shift that mindset or change it. So it's balancing the communication methods is probably a better way of describing it because you want to encourage that mix of communication. So organizations obviously encourage their teams. Typically, what happened because of the pandemic was a lot of organizations that hadn't worked remotely before, rather than rethinking their way of working, they simply try to map what they did in an office virtually or digitally. Now, that was okay because it kind of got them through the small amount of period, but it's not sustainable. It's not sustainable for lots of reasons, for productivity, for cost. More importantly, though, employees really burn out when they're in an environment where it's constant synchronous communication and the requirement for immediate responses. I think a lot of people refer to it as like the green dot. If you're on Teams or if you're in an environment where that's kind of being monitored quite a lot, that's not a good space to be in. So you want to encourage the ability to shift your communication methods to allow you greater control over the time that you have, which is super important. Now, the reason why that's important is just what we're touching on there. So, like a lot of meeting cultures can be changed. You can start to craft much more time for deep focus time as well. But there's lots of studies that have shown that where you get the balance right, there's higher levels of trust, there are better communication, and there's just overall greater team effectiveness, where you can do that. So we'll touch on some of the things that you can do to shift that. The final piece on the slide here, just before I jump on, is this is talking about like the form of asynchronous communication. What I mean by that is you've probably all been in environments, and everyone's been guilty of this, I'm pretty sure, like of sending a message to someone where you just say hello or you just say hi and you hit send, and that's all you send. That's a great example of like maybe being in a synchronous type culture environment, because straight away that person might get a ping and then they're already disconnected from what they're focused on. Um, a Harvard study last year showed that it takes up to 25 minutes for someone to refocus on a task once they've been interrupted. What's more important to understand is actually self-interruptions. And because of the digital environment that everyone has grown up in and everyone's now exposed to, you actually self-interrupt more than other people interrupting yourself. So asynchronous communication is important because it allows you to put much more focus on one piece of work at a time. There's lots of ways that we can get into that, and that might be a different webinar about how you actually structure control over your calendar for deep focus time, how you close down windows when you're focusing on a piece of work or configure your notifications. But it's all super, super important because if you can focus on work and get into that, not flow, because flow is a difficult state to get in, it's more creative people that get into that state. But asynchronous communication allows you to start to think about that type of stuff. So what I'm talking about here is time boxed or convenience based. Convenience based, you can kind of ignore unless you're in like an amazing, fully remote company who are their culture is flying. That's where the rituals are so developed and the practices are so developed. People are just in that mindset constantly of, hey, I don't need to respond right in this moment. They've got communication charters within their team. Again, a great exercise to do, like, is to map out with your team, right? How do we communicate? What is our choice for chat, for file collaboration? What do we need to do if we have any urgent or crisis situations? How to connect? So what you're looking at just now is probably time boxed. All that means is rather than saying, hey, and then someone's like seeing the dots happening, you're actually just framing that in a different way. And I'll bring up an example of that. So the bottom one shows that you're just giving context. So I might say, hey, whoever, this is what I'm looking for. I'm hoping to get this achieved by the end of this week. Can you let me know if that timescale suits you? Any more information you need? You try and provide as much context as possible. But what you're really doing is being super kind to them in terms of, I understand you've got work. I understand appreciative of the timescales, but also we're trying to shift some of this to asynchronous. It's not always the case, but that should be something you're working towards. So time box is something to try and practice. I've actually seen some people use their out of office to even mention that. Hey, if you want to connect with me, just let me know like what you're looking for, the kind of scope of urgency, and when you need it for before you send a message. That might seem rude to certain people, but I think it's just nice to set that context as well. So yeah. Okay, so what I'm going to touch on now is like, and I'm trying to just keep an eye on the chat, which is why I'm pausing from time to time. So, some really great comments in there. And Nicola, yes, it's my pet peeve as well. I've got an article that I can share on the community later of like, don't just say hello in chat. It's existed for a long time, but it's quite a good one. Um, so what we're looking at here now is why is it important to sort of reevaluate what you do synchronously, especially when it comes to meetings? So Microsoft carried out a study where they put some EG caps on, sorry, EEG caps on people and volunteers, and they were monitoring people who were in like constant meetings or back-to-back meetings or a lot of meetings in a day versus people who had the ability for deep focus time. They may still have had a few meetings, but they had a lot more time around that. So what you're seeing on the screen is really the results of that. So straight away, the blue color, the deeper blue, is a less stressed brain, a brain that's functioning a lot more nicely in terms of well-being and focus and contribution. And the higher the color goes from yellow to orange to red is a highly stressed brain as well. So what you've seen here is the top one is where there's been no breaks. It's like you're just literally going back to back. And a lot of people who have experienced that, I've experienced it myself. It almost takes you like 10 or 15 minutes to like get focused into that next meeting because you're already thinking of the tasks that you need to pick up or the follow-up from the last meeting. So what you're trying to do here is be really kind in terms of, right, how do I create space and create a lot more purpose to the meetings that I'm having? And we're just going to talk about some of the techniques that you can put in place to do that. So rather than simply default to a meeting, I think one of the things you can do, not necessarily challenge a meeting culture, is just ask the question, do I need a meeting? Because for what I said there, too often they're held for probably the wrong reasons. And a lot of leaders can be guilty of that as well. And a lot of that can come through going back to adaptive leaders. If you're not adaptive, you'll kind of want to work in the same way you worked in an office where like a lot of leaders might have interrupted people to see what they were doing and what they were focused on. Whereas if you adapt, you've got the digital tools now that allow you to do that. And that allows you to be a lot more strategic and visionary as a leader as well. So it's about challenging that. So I think in the chat, as we go through here, it'd be really great just to for people to think about like, is there something you do just now in terms of meetings or communication that could be moved to asynchronous that would benefit you? There might be people that can learn from that as well. So we'll go through some examples of that. So what we'll do on the screen here is these are meetings that I would typically say can be asynchronous. And then there's meetings that are very important, I would say, especially as a leader and a manager, like to have synchronously and put a lot of emphasis and importance on those meetings. And what I mean by that is leaders will often be in a lot of one-to-ones with their teams. One of the things I always try and emphasize is try and make sure you're coming to each one of those your best self and fully focused. Because I think in a lot of environments, leaders can be 5 minutes late or 10 minutes late. But for that knowledge worker or skill worker, that might be their most important meeting of the day because they're meeting a leader, they're meeting a manager, they're meeting someone they look up to. So try and just think about that when you're coming into those sessions. I think like check-ins and stand-ups, I think feedback, top-down presentations, these types of things are things that can be shifted to asynchronous, and we'll talk about how to shift as well. Synchronous meetings are still important. Like I said, I think for me, like career development, one-to-ones are super important. I think when you're trying to like work through some difficult situations, difficult conversations, but then also like relationship building. A lot of companies have lost their budgets for like retreats and bringing their teams together. It's something I would love to see more organizations bring back because those intentional in-person things really build relationship, which is great. So it's super important. So have a look at these things, and when we come to the end, we'll touch on some of the key takeaways. But I think for me, definitely looking at your calendar, identifying things that you might be able to have conversations with your manager or your team, say, hey, like, why don't we try this asynchronously or try it a little bit differently? Just to see if that can free up a bit more space for you to not only develop yourself, but also have that more focused time as well. Okay, so the other thing to think about is when you have meetings. So we're getting really into meetings at the minute, but the reason why this is super important is when you have a meeting, don't just become like, not lazy, wrong term, but don't just make it like, hey, I'm having a meeting, I just need to show up. What you need to do is like really prepare for that. So what we're doing here is like these are practices for like how do you make your meetings great and how do you make them inclusive. So there's lots of tools involved in this as well, but I think agendas are like super important. So I think we've got a great term at Andela, no agenda, no attenda. And you definitely need to practice and manifest that as a leader to really get that happening. Because if you don't, a lot of people will then just sort of, I suppose, behavior breeds behavior is what I'm saying. So if you're not exerting that from an executive or a leadership perspective, then people might not feel like they need to put an agenda into meetings or provide context. So it's super important to do that. where you're doing asynchronous first, or you've got a much better balance in communication, then you will then allow people time to pre-read content. A lot of organizations will jump onto a meeting and they might read notes for the first 20 minutes of a 60-minute meeting, because basically because the culture is a way that it's very difficult for people to craft time to look at it. But if you get the right balance, you will allow people the deeper headspace to do that as well, which is important. I think as well, like being mindful, and this is where supportive tools are great now, because you've got things like AI, Copilot, and there's a tool called TLDV, Too Long Didn't View. This is where you can record your meetings, record the transcripts, and AI can do a lot of the heavy lifting. So if someone's missed a 60-minute meeting, they might just come in and be able to watch a 10-minute summary. They might be able to catch up really quickly on what they've missed and what they need to do. But also, if you're running the meeting, you're able to sort of share notes, actions in a much more inclusive way where people can contribute before the meeting, during the meeting, after the meeting, which is really important as well. So I think I'm just seeing in the chat, people are struggling. Yeah, one person's struggling to hear me. If you give me a thumbs up or something, if everyone else can hear me, okay, that'd be great. Right, cool. Um, I'll continue. So yeah, I think the other thing to think about in a culture with meetings is, well, how do I go around that? Which, because it's a difficult thing. If you've got an exec group or a management group that are very meeting focused and they don't want to think or rethink their ways of working, like how do you approach that? So there's some examples here on the screen of like how do I politely decline unnecessary meetings? So these are examples that you could potentially use. You don't have to go about it this way. I think it's better to do it in person or synchronously when you're having these chats. But what you're really thinking about is the same concept of, hey, thanks for including me in this, but I think this is something we could solve by doing it this way and showcasing how you can do it. Because one question you should always ask yourself is when you say yes to a meeting, what are you saying no to? And I think that is really important. So effective remote work really requires maintaining healthy boundaries as well as doing great work. But that includes learning to say no when it's necessary, but also being transparent about how you can do it more effectively. So you're not saying no for the sake of it. You're not just declining a meeting without context. You're having a conversation about how you can do it more effectively, and then learning from that as well. Okay, so that wraps up meetings in a nutshell. I just want to allow time for Q&A. So this last section won't take too long. What we're looking at here is a need for documentation and knowledge management. This again goes towards effective communication. So the reason why this is important is we all want more control over our time in organizations. Um, and I think for me, it's not about what you know, because a lot of time, if what you know, you will invite a lot of interruptions. So if you're a subject matter expert, people will start to message you. Whereas if you document it and you showcase it in a place where people can go and just retrieve that information, that's so much more powerful. Number one, the company isn't just reliant on one individual, it's documented, but also for people that are onboarding to an organization or they're new to an organization, they can go and find that information readily. If you're in different time zones, you're not waiting to someone to start to come back to you with an answer, you can go and find that. It really is the secret kind of sauce, I suppose, to enabling high performance. So I think it's important. Where it can be difficult sometimes is it's very focused on writing, and obviously across different geographies and different cultures, there can be confusion sometimes or dysfunction. So I think being very deliberate on choosing what that model is like and who's building that content is super important as well. But ultimately, this is like I love this example here, and it's really because a lot of research that I've done in the past, this is always in the top three things that people just want in an organization. It's like, I just want to know where to go to get the information I need to do my job. It's pretty much as simple as that. If you ask someone like, where's a file, the amount of people in organizations that have to check about 7 or 8 different places. I actually did a time and motion study years ago, and then we did some technology behind it, and like people were spending in this organization 4.5 days a year just trying to find the information they need to do their job. So like if you just think of like how much friction has that got from an employee experience, how much money is that costing the organization? Um, and even from an onboarding experience, that's awful as well. So like if you can start to tackle these things, like not only are you going to get time and stress reduction, you're going to have more time for professional growth. You're going to have more time for deep focus. Comes back to what we talked about before, work-life balance. But the collective benefits for the company are not only the time savings, the productivity, there's far more consistency. If you've got one place where you can go and get that information, you can trust that information and that source, which reduces the errors. And then also, again, coming back to subject matter experts, some of you may have heard the term answering with a link. Essentially, all you're saying is like if a question that's asked frequently can't be answered with a link to the answer, then someone should create that content and address that because ultimately people want to find that information. So yeah, it's super important. What I would say about this journey and this process for companies is um I suppose it's saying the quiet part out loud, shifting from tribal knowledge to like a documented process is really difficult and it takes a lot of learning. So there is discomfort. It's difficult even from a technology perspective and getting people to do that. So you need a leadership buy-in, but you also need people who are really bought into that as well. And they are documenting and they're trying to like drive the adoption of it as well. And that's just this slide. I'll not spend much time, but that's just touches on that. Like, what are the steps you would need to take place to do that, in terms of implementing a tool as well. Okay, so conscious of time, this last slide really talks about, and I'd love you guys to like look into this a bit more detail at the end, but this is how you shift, which is really important. It's like, what are the key shifts? How do you build an asynchronous workplace? And again, it's not async only, it's async first. Um, and then how do you prioritize that as well? So I'm not going to go through these bullets. These bullets were really just so that you guys can consume this afterwards. But it's really about shifting as a fundamental change that you need in that communication practice. So written documentation, deep work, mindful disconnection, all these things are supported by the right tools and they will lead to better productivity, reduce burnout, and better work-life balance as well. So yeah, I'm going to wrap up in the next 30 seconds so that we can jump to questions. Because I hoped I would get through that a little bit quicker, so apologies. But the key takeaways again for consumption afterwards, but just try and remember like effective communication and remote work, it's not just about productivity, it's about sort of creating that sustainable, healthy work environment. Um, and I think the other thing as well is like just check in with your emotions. Like if you're practicing checking in with yourself on a regular basis, that's really important because then you're judging yourself on curiosity rather than judgment. Um, in terms of the biggest next step, I would say like everybody just look at their own current practices or processes. Are there any areas where you could start to implement more effective communication or time management? How could that benefit not only yourself, but like I said earlier, how do you demonstrate to your team or to your organization and then start to experiment with that? Like that's the most important way of doing it. As I said before, it's not prescriptive. Every team is different. You won't have universal adoption of these things. No one will ever universally adopt change of ways of working, but if you can get the majority of people doing it, it can be really powerful as well. Okay, so apologies overran a little bit, and I know we've only got about 5 minutes for questions, but um, yeah, I'm going to jump over the chat. But if the community, if you guys want to jump in to ask any questions, or if you picked up on any as I try and navigate this chat, that would be great. And then some,
Hi, Gary, can you hear me?
yeah, I can, yeah.
Awesome. That was a great session. Like I had like I had my notes. I was, taking notes as you went along because there was so much that, we all gleaned from your talk. We have questions and I see that the chat has been, blowing up with, people mentioning that they don't have access to the community. I mean, we'll delve into that much later, but I want us to I mean, if you have more questions, please put it on the Q&A tab. Right now we have, I think our first question is, are daily check-ins productivity killers in remote work? How much is too much? And how many meetings a day are enough, especially for developers?
So yeah, it's one that you need to navigate over time. Like there's no prescriptive, hey, you should have 4 meetings. I think when you're working on something new, there should always be like a check-in as a team to basically come together and work on things. I think if after that though, like as a developer, like essentially, unless you're coming together with your manager or your team, or the other stakeholders, then most things can be done asynchronously. I think it's about being very intentional about setting up how to effectively communicate. So, for instance, I used to run a team that was full of UXers, product owners, and front end and back end engineers. So, we went from 3 stand-ups a week, this was many years ago, to 1 stand-up a week, which is much more focused on barriers. So, we started to build what was called quick wins on a Monday. The quick wins were what are the small things we can knock over that have been challenging. We also set on a Friday, everyone had a responsibility to asynchronously go into the reporting channel and push what were the things that they achieved that week, what's up next week, and what are the barriers that are impacting them. As a leader, that allowed me to see as a team, like what we're working on, what are the barriers that I can focus on to allow them to do better, but also as the rest of the team, they could also see at what stage people were at. And then if there was things we had to come together for crisis management, we could do that. So yeah, I'm sorry, I can't say like a specific number, but I do think over time, like I gave their example, we went from 3 to 1 to changing the style of that to then moving to asynchronous. There's tons of ways that you just evolve over time. So yeah, it's just evaluating for yourself how productive do you think these things are, and not being afraid to say to your manager or your leader, could we try this out? I think it's important just to be able to do that.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that. I mean, there's so many questions coming in, which is nice, so keep them going. And so I think the next question is for stand-ups, is it better to post your updates, blockers, progress on Slack, or just have a 30-minute meeting?
So my honest opinion is I think it's better to have an asynchronous channel which is geared towards your status updates. So you ultimately most people will have like Jira or Trello or Sana to show their progress indicators, and it's your responsibility as a developer to make sure those are up to date. Because again, you don't want to invite questions on that. You want to create more transparency. But for me, like having a channel, because what that means is when you come together as a team, you're focused on much more purposeful things rather than just going around a team asking for updates. And again, though, you need to have the right balance because if you don't, people might not read those updates. So you need to have the right balance where we got to a point where our teams were they were quite keen to learn what's Andrew doing on the design front, and he might do a video because he's a designer, and it like, hey guys, this is what I worked on this week. Here's the barrier. So as a leader, I might say, hey, like actually our session is to come together to try and work through this challenge that we've got, rather than Andrew, what have you done? What's up this week? So I know it's difficult because you need to make those changes and you need to have difficult conversations, but it's so important because it just gives people a lot more freedom and focus on their work, and they don't feel like they're going to a meeting where they're sitting waiting for 25 minutes for them to just give their update, if that makes sense.
Yeah. And just to add to that, I think it's also good to understand like the way of communication in that particular team. I 100% agree with you, Gary. It will be nice to also post, your updates and, blockers in progress such that, people come into any meeting or stand up with that understanding so that you're not, having to go over those things that you probably have mentioned. I am pro like async and less
Yeah.
meetings, so
But
that
it's
you're
difficult, yeah. And it is really difficult because you're going to have that transition where you might be going from back-to-back meetings where people just don't have the time to do that. So you have to have those conversations to allow the time to be able to do that. Which is why some companies do the 20 minutes at the start of a meeting. But really, if you
Mhm.
think of that over time, it's not as progressive. So yeah, every culture is different, every organization is different. So.
Yeah. Our next question is from Okuchi. Who in the organization should be responsible to document processes and information. And just to add to that, technologists also spend a lot of time coding, debugging, and so is it also on them to, document as well? What do you advise?
Yeah, this is always a hard one. So, in an ideal world, you would have an internal communications team and you would have a community rep for each function or department that would almost be the stakeholder or the key stakeholder. Where you've got a subject matter expert, you would hope that they would be able to document if there was something that they felt the team would be beneficial. That's not going to be massively impactful for their time, but there should be specific owners within the team that are championing and driving the adoption and the rituals of it. Because if you don't have that, it'll become stagnated. People probably won't refer to it. It'll become out of date as well. So the internal communications team or the stakeholders who are running it should have reviews on a constant basis of the information. That should happen at least monthly or quarterly. And then you should have people within those functions that are responsible for that. That might be an expense a lot of companies don't want to do, which is why I say documentation and single source of truth is difficult. What you could do if you don't want to go down that path is an older style intranet approach where there is people that are managing internal news and documentation. You might want to leverage maybe your top asked questions or guidance or policies within that environment. And then if people see the value of it, you might then be able to say, hey, we've been able to demonstrate that people are utilizing this. It is beneficial. Can we maybe build upon that? But yeah, it's very difficult. A lot of it comes down to money and resources. So
Yeah, true. And I think also documenting where documentation is not available is also great to, show yourself as a leader. So if you are not stretched and you have bandwidth and you see that there's opportunity to document, processes or, things that you're working on and share with the larger organization, it actually shows your leadership skills and it shows that you're thinking far just above like your job description and the company as well.
it's a really great point. And even just if you think of being kind to people that are joining the company, it's such a nicer experience if people onboarding have got information to refer to and they don't feel like they're like bothering people or frustrating people by asking certain things. So it gives people a lot more sort of self-agency, if that makes sense. So but yeah, it's the benefits of it are massive and the cost saving that companies can have. So it's something that should happen, in my opinion, but it's kind of difficult to get companies to think that way sometimes.
Okay, we have only time for one more question, and I'm just going to ask this as a two-part question. Sixtus wants to know what mediums are best for async communications, and then Aaron has an interesting question about what's your view on bosses who keep asking for unplanned prompts in meetings? Like sometimes you're not prepared and they want you to do training to customers or some key stakeholders.
Um, so yeah, we'll take that one first. My memory is never great in these things, and then we'll come back to the second one. So yeah, I think on that one, like it's just about alignment. You're as a leader or as a manager, I think it's fine to be able to ask someone to do something that they deem as urgent. And it might be off kilter of what's been planned. Like that will happen from time to time. That's just work. But I think the best way of doing it is like if you've got a tool like Asana or Trello or things should be mapped up over time. So people should be pretty clear on what they're working towards and what outcome that then influences. So I think always referring back to that. I think when managers are running meetings, like those things should already be aware. That's why I talk about transparency and clarity. Like if I'm in the team, it should be pretty clear when I'm wrapping up a week, I already know what my tasks are for the next week or the week beyond that. But as I say, there might be certain occasions where those might be shifted or changed. I think you just have to adapt to that. Um, I know it's not always ideal because you might be like, hey, I was meant to work on this and now I'm having to work on this task and I'm still expected to do that. So I would just have that conversation about how does that fit in with my flow and am I being expected to do all of those things in the one week? Because that's then unrealistic. So, and then the other
Yeah.
question, can you remind me about that? Sorry.
The mediums are best for async comms.
Yeah, so I came back to that point. The tool is not the goal, and it's so important because Asynchronous, synchronous, and communication is about the practices, the rituals, the culture. The tool just enables it, and it's really important to think about that. The tools to enable it go back to those three fundamental ones. You need a, I hate to say, digital version of your office. So that can be Slack, it can be Teams. Where people misuse that is they see chat as direct messaging type thing. Like they don't see chat in an asynchronous form where it's time boxed. Also, a lot of people don't utilize like Teams in the right way. And I mean like the actual Teams where you've got your channels. If you structure those correctly, you can have social channels, project channels, reporting channels that can form a way for you to be more asynchronous. And then you just layer those with what's then facilitating our tasks for the week and our overall goal. So is that Asana? Is that Trello? Is that Microsoft Planner? And then assigning those tasks. So as an individual, I know I only need to go to two places in a day activity if it's Teams, because then I can see what's relevant to me. Or I can go to my task by planner again to see the team, but also to see what's relevant to me. I shouldn't be going through channels like a conveyor belt
Yeah.
of information trying to find that. So yeah.
That's a great answer. Okay, do we have one? Could we take this last question? I think we could really be fast with this and then we'll call it a day.
Yeah,
This
let's
is
go.
something I feel everyone will benefit from the answer. How does one manage to set time box sessions for deep focus work without being taken for not being responsive?
So I think you need to take responsibility for your own calendar to start with. So there are tools that can help you, and those might be the best way to do it because they're suggesting. So if you use Microsoft, a lot of people use Microsoft, a lot of people use Slack. There's tools in Google as well to do this. Let's just use Microsoft for this example. There's a product called Viva Insights, which is free with all E1, E3 licenses. In there, you can go to a tab called Focus Time. It will analyze your calendar and look for spaces where it will populate focus time. When you're in focus time, it automatically changes your notifications to do not disturb. That's a good one to go down if you're in an environment where you might get questioned a lot because you can say, well, I kind of got the tool to analyze, this is what I'm practicing. But then you need to back that up with, okay, but because of that focus time, I was able to produce this at this quality of work. And over time, your leader, your manager should be able to see that anyway. The other way is literally taking ownership of your calendar, so blocking out the time. And I think this is a better way of doing it, more sustainable. Like figure out, there's lots of tools online, like when am I most optimum in my work setting? So for some people, it might be first thing in the morning, it might be the afternoon, it might be evening. Maybe look at that and then block out some focus time around that space and just see, am I more productive when I'm able to focus on one task to completion? Was there fewer interruptions? Did I feel more fulfilled in that task? Was it better to be able to do that rather than doing 10 small pieces that aren't complete versus one or two small pieces that can be complete? And then if people question you, your simple answer back is, well, these are the tasks that I'm working towards this week. So I'm focusing in that period. You don't need to stick to that. Like I get asked that quite a lot. I've got so much focus time all over my calendar, and people will say, oh my gosh, when can I have a meeting with you? You're so back to back. And I was like, well, I'm not. Like I use it for focus time, but I can shift here. Don't get me wrong, that's a privileged position, but it shouldn't be privileged. It should be expected. I don't think you should be privileged to be in that position, especially when you're a developer or a designer, you're doing work that requires deep focus. Sorry for my long-winded answer. I'm just super passionate about this because it's so important that people craft that time for themselves. Otherwise, they will just burn out as well, which has a whole realm of other problems. So yeah.
Yeah, okay, that was good. And I think the person actually says thank you because that's important. It's important that you communicate your time when you are in focus time with your team so that they're aware and they know what to expect during that time.
Yeah.
But this was amazing. Gary, we have to bring you on again to talk more about this, because there's so many sections of, this talk that we could expand more on, but this was really, really helpful. Please, guys, blow up the chat, react, emojis. And I mean, thank you so much, Gary, for this talk. The slides and the recording will be shared. You get it, via email as well, and in the community space. But thank you so much, guys, for joining. You can see the emojis. I mean, we all love this. We appreciate you for coming to speak to us about effective communication. And I do hope that everyone on this call has something that they're taking back on as an action, to put into, their work.
No, thanks very much for having me on, and I hope everyone was okay with the accent and the recording. I did joke about this yesterday, but you can set your speed to 0.5 and that'll make perfect sense.
No worries. Thank you so much, Gary. Bye, everyone. Thank you so much for joining.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks.
Great.